Welcome to today's lesson on the effects of World War I, where we discuss about how the Treaty of Versailles affected Europe and the United States as well past World War I. We just got done talking about World War I and all of its effects during the war, talked about the different types of technology, different types of weapons, but now we're going to get into the bulk of what happened after the war, starting with the Treaty of Versailles. As we can see, the period of this time was from 1919 to 1920, and this will give you a pretty good idea of how things were set forward for essentially the next 20 years of world history. So as we move on and get into the notes and the lesson for today, we have this essential question. How did borders and maps change after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles? As we go through the slides, think about this question and try to have it in your mind of how borders and maps within Europe in particular changed because of the repercussions of the war. For a warm-up to help us get acclimated to this lesson, we're going to think back to our previous unit on imperialism and in particular the Scramble for Africa. If you can remember, in the Scramble for Africa we learned that during the Berlin Conference, many European nations convened and came together to decide to split up Africa in order to exploit its resources. Now, using that knowledge, based off of what happened at the Berlin Conference and its effect on Africa, what do you think will happen to Europe after the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles, which is essentially pretty similar to what was discussed at the Berlin Conference? Now, as we get into talking about the effects of World War I, obviously the statistics behind the casualties and the costs behind the war are significant into what would eventually become the Treaty of Versailles. To start off, we had approximately 8.5 million soldiers that died throughout the war. Of those 8.5 million, Russia lost the most of the Allied troops, which was 1.7 million. Russia obviously had the largest fighting force in World War I, so this would make sense that they would potentially be the ones to lose the most lives. 21 million were wounded, bringing our number up to 28.5 million people that were casualties of World War I. Let's remember that casualties refers to people affected by the war. It doesn't necessarily mean deaths. To distinguish those two terms, we'll use fatalities to describe those who died, but casualty can be those who were either died or wounded. And the war costs about $338 billion, which in today's money would be well over $1 trillion. So very costly war, and this will prove significant because eventually there will need to be reparations and repayment to try to recover from the war, and we'll see how the Treaty of Versailles assessed these damages. So moving on, okay, what happened with the Treaty of Versailles, or how did it come to be? First, we had the Allies meeting at the Paris Peace Conference. This began on January 18, 1919 at the Palace of Versailles in Paris, France. At this meeting, it lasted for about a year, where the major leaders of European countries, including the United States, met for about a year to deliberate exactly how they should assess the damage, what repercussions were going to be assessed, and who is going to be responsible for that. Now, at this conference, you had 32 countries that were invited. Germany was not one of these countries. For obvious reasons, Germany was the main perpetrator in World War I. They started the war, and they did not want to have Germany present at a conference where they would eventually be reprimanding Germany and placing sanctions on them. See the Palace of Versailles, which obviously we've seen before if we go back to our previous units from earlier in the year when we learned about the society structure in France, and we learned about the French Revolution. Now the treaty itself, okay, what did it do? Well, it forced Germany to assume full blame for causing the war. This was something that Germany did not take very lightly. In fact, a lot of Germans became resentful of the fact that they were given the full blame. It imposed huge reparations on Germany. Remember, reparations can involve things like sanctions and punishments, but in this case, these reparations refer specifically to money that was going to need to be repaid to the Allies to help essentially restructure Europe because of the damage that was caused. So the treaty aimed to weaken Germany by doing a few things, including limiting the size of their military. Because the leaders knew that these sanctions weren't going to be taken lightly by Germany, that they might also become upset by these sanctions. They wanted to limit the size of their military so that they couldn't retaliate or eventually cause another war. Second thing they did was they returned Alsace and Lorraine back to France, which is two cities that neighbor on the French and German border. Next, they removed hundreds of miles of territory from Germany. This proved to be devastating to their economy because not just by limiting the miles of territory and their scope of influence in Europe, they also stripped away many of their overseas colonies. And as we learned before in imperialism, these colonies that they had were very productive and very useful to their economy. And so we see when you have reparations that are being imposed, but an economy that's being limited because you're stripping them of their colonies, you can see how this is not adding up to be a very fortunate outcome for Germany. And this became known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, as we see with changing borders, the French and British drew the borders of the modern Middle East, and the Europeans created mandates to control the Middle East. And also, this led to the collapse of the Russian Empire, which created Poland, the Baltics, and Finland. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was probably the largest of all, was dissolved into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And the German Empire became Germany, and Germany lost substantial territory outside of Europe, like we just mentioned. And here we see in 1914, this is what the map looked like prior to World War I starting. We see the German Empire stretched over a large piece of land. We see Russia as well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. All had substantial amounts of land. But as we move to 1919, post-war, we see that Germany had been broken up. We see that Poland becomes its own country. We have Czechoslovakia that becomes its own. Romania breaks off, becomes smaller, and you have Hungary that becomes a smaller country along with Austria. Yugoslavia becomes its own country. And the Ottoman Empire breaks up, and the main part of the Ottoman Empire now becomes present-day Turkey. And so with that, now that concludes this introductory lesson on how the Treaty of Versailles affected borders and maps after World War I. If you can go back to the essential question and answer that in your notebooks and have it ready for the beginning of class tomorrow for our class discussion, we can do that.